nonpartisan group of individuals united in anger and committed to direct action to end the AIDS crisis.
ACT UP was not one monolithic institution. It was a group of people who met every Monday night, and many of them were parts of smaller groups or cells or affinity groups within the larger group, and those affinity groups to some extent had, if not a separate life, a life outside the group. So it was much more molecular in structure.
We're the Awning Leapers. We're from ACT UP New York.
I'm Maxine again.
And I'm Linda.
And I'm from the Coast Affinity Group in New York.
So the idea of affinity groups was from the civil rights movement and also from the women's movement. You know, and the whole idea was that when you get trained to do civil disobedience, that you have to you break down the group into smaller groups, so that you sort of know everybody and everybody knows you, and you can support each other in a very specific kind of way.
We're the Invisible Women. We're from ACT UP New York.
We are Los Locas Radicales, and WAR, which is WAR is wipe out AIDS and racism.
Affinity groups within ACT UP, if they worked, when they worked, for their lifetime, could be almost like these close-knit communities. But if an affinity group did something that put your bodies on the line, risked arrest, and sometimes actually did arrest, I'll speak at least for myself, my fear level was always very high, and I don't know if I could have done it without a group of people within which I felt close to. I'd seen in similar situations, lots, trusted, liked, and several of them loved. Some of them were people I was as close to as any people I've been to in my life.
For civil disobedience, I think it's absolutely critical to do an affinity group structure for safety.
Again, locking arms, it's painful, and that force of resistance that you're providing can be used against you.
We really talked about trying to get everybody in the group trained for civil disobedience, because you don't always know when it's going to happen or when you're going to want to do it.
The message that was repeated over and over was drugs into bodies.
We wanted access to drugs, and we wanted a much quicker approval process, or we wanted stuff given to people before it was approved.
The whole process of the FDA, the drug testing process, took years. We don't have years. This disease was taking people in months.
FDA, don't delay! 52 will die today!
Release the drugs! Release the drugs! Release the drugs! Release the drugs!
My name is Vito Russo. I'm a writer from New York City, and I have AIDS, and I'm here today because I don't want to die. I know that there are 80 drugs that haven't been tested yet by the FDA. I want to know why it takes 5 to 10 years in this country to test drugs that you can test in Europe in a third of the time. We are simply asking the FDA to do it quicker.
We found out, at least within those few years, if you could identify an obvious problem, if you could get the media on board about it, if you could get 200 to 300 ACT UP people sitting in at a very particular target and making it very, very uncomfortable for the powers that were, you could affect very, very quick change.
Because I had been part of the mainstream media, I understood it. and I could explain it to activists and therefore help strategize how to take that knowledge and use it to our own ends. Because we had activists from all over the country for that action, we had found people from all over and designated them as media spokespeople. And the national press did show up to that action in quite large numbers. Mike, I think, Signorelli, turned to the press and said, over there are people from 20 different states, each holding a little placard saying where they're from, ready to be your local spokesperson on these issues.
That made the difference between the protests getting page 5 in the Arizona paper or the Dallas Morning News and being on the front page because there was a local person there.
When we went to the FDA in 1988, one of the slogans I came up with was, healthcare is a human right. And I thought the more that we could press that as a moral cause, it was something that we could ally ourselves with many people outside of the gay world and the AIDS world.
The healthcare system in this country has not worked equally for everyone, and that has been illuminated for me personally as a white gay man in dramatic ways, because women have always known this. I think it's one of the reasons why lesbians in particular, but women in general, have taken such an active role in this struggle.
If you look up, you will see that there are hundreds of FDA employees at the windows watching what's going on. They are not doing business as usual. Commissioner Frank Young is in Geneva. He's skipped town rather than deal with this. The police are trying to arrest people and take them off to jail. We are interfering with that by blocking the buses from leaving. We will not let business as usual continue. We will interfere with it everywhere and anywhere we can.
What the FDA did was shift the group away from a defensive posture to an offensive posture. When the FDA action enabled us to come up with a vision for the way that healthcare should be done in this country, the way that drugs should be researched and sold and made available. The idea was to cut through the bureaucratic red tape of the Food and Drug Administration, but more than that, that people with AIDS should be involved in every level of decision-making concerning research for a treatment and a cure for our disease.
It was a turning point because it was the front page of every major newspaper in the country. It was the lead story on all of the nightly newscasts. It was really the start of the national AIDS movement, was the FDA demonstration. And the relationship with the FDA was really transformed. It changed. Drug approval standards changed. The demonstration was a really important piece in forcing the agency to realize that they had to deal with us in a way that they weren't used to dealing with consumers.
One day this woman just showed up, this housewife, who had been a scientist and still was, and said, "You guys don't know diddly about what this is. And anybody who wants to learn about the system, how it works, how grants are made, how the science works, how everything works, how the NIH works, how the FDA works, how you can deal with all this enormous amount of material, I'll teach you."
There should be much more funding than there is for infectious diseases.
Iris was not gay, but she could not see with what was going on around her and what she knew, not reaching out to the affected communities of AIDS. I waited and went up to Iris afterwards and said, "I'm interested in what you were saying. I'd like to know more. I'd like to help."
And a few people joined her, and that became a bigger and bigger group, and that became the Treatment and Data Committee, T&D.
They're still getting a whole lot more money than actually getting those treatments than anybody is.
It was kind of a dorky activity for a bunch of East Village hipsters and artists to sit around reading medical journal articles. We called it Science Club, like it was chess club or something.
There aren't drugs.
Individual after individual had to come to grips with the fact that I will survive the longest, the most I know about what I'm putting into my body. So they all had to become scientists to some degree.
There was no guiding agenda, there was no leadership, there was no global strategy for how to deal with AIDS in the US. And so on the bus back from Bethesda, we decided to write a treatment agenda because nobody was dealing with the entire map of AIDS, the entire constellation of opportunistic infections, the gaps in research, the underrepresented populations, the fact that the diseases and the drugs might be different in those populations. How would we ever find out? They weren't even being studied.
I'd just like to say that the reasons I can't get any of these drugs is because for 9 years now, the leadership in this country has failed to come up with a plan of action. They failed to come up with a plan of research, a national research agenda. People with AIDS and their advocates have finally done this for them. This is it. This is the plan we're presenting. We need our government to read this plan. We need them to work with us. If they want to change it a little, we'll talk to them. But I want them to adopt it. I want them to get started on it. I want them to save our lives. Thank you.
I snuck around and grabbed one of those copies, and it was very interesting.
We believe that the United States has a global responsibility to quickly develop effective treatments not only for HIV infection itself, but for all of the opportunistic infections which actually cause suffering and death in people living with AIDS.
This is not a new agenda, and it is not an agenda of only ACT UP. Scientists agree with this. Why can't we have it?
The researchers and regulators are going to have to come up with a parallel release program that will get drugs to the people who need it before the 5 years down the pike where they may be approved by the FDA.
I was scribbling madly in this copy of their AIDS treatment research agenda. I would go back and forth between saying, no, they don't understand, to saying, whoa, you mean this isn't the way we're doing trials? You mean people aren't allowed to do this or that? But I have to tell you that I was still not ready to sort of go up to them and try and engage. I brought this copy back and I distributed it to a small group of statisticians that was meeting regularly to talk about trial design issues. The people sitting around that table got as excited as I did. This has clearly been written by people who were very knowledgeable, very intelligent, and really wanted to do the trials the best possible way. They were not against trials. They wanted to get the right answers, but they wanted what they called humane trials.
AIDS activists stormed the government's premier disease research center. The National Institutes of Health is where an AIDS cure might be found. It is where therapies are being tested in clinical trials.
No more secret meetings! No more
Demonstrators blocked access to buildings. Scientists and administrators reporting to work stood around looking confused. Activists charged the Bush administration with foot-dragging on AIDS research. It's not the amount of federal money allocated to it, so much as how research priorities are defined.
We need new drugs to keep people alive, but the NIH is only testing old drugs that we already have.
In that building down that way, Dr. Anthony Fauci is deciding the research priorities for the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. We're down here because we think we should be deciding the research priorities, because these are the people who know what's going on, because they're dealing with it every day.
We found out we had won some of our NIH demands. Fauci came up to me and said, we had a meeting, we decided that we're going to put you guys on all the committees, and we're going to let your observers go to the meetings, and the meetings won't be secret anymore.
Never again could any of this be done without taking people with AIDS and their advocates into consideration. This would be public business from now on.
No, we should all be going through the bushes like this, like sticking our heads up.
It was beginning to feel a little different because we'd spent all the time up until then being on the outside, sort of beating on the doors and trying to get in. And now they actually wanted to hear what we had to say.
We had this one particular compound that looked like it may have had the potency and the physical properties that we wanted, and it could be a possible drug.
We said, let's put this in HIV-infected individuals and let's see what happens. So we went into HIV-infected individuals with this drug called Crixivan, and you could see a very substantial drop. Just with the one protease inhibitor, you can see a very substantial drop in virus load. So that was the first week. The second week was very disappointing because what we saw in the second week was in fact virus load coming right back up again. One exception.
There was one patient that, patient 143, I believe, was his number, that the virus went down and stayed down.
That told us that it was possible. If it could happen in one, then by definition, it can happen in everyone. You just need to figure out how to do it. That puts you in a completely different place and in a completely different state of mind. So then the question became, okay, now what do we need to do in order to make it possible?
Mark collected all of our writings, pieces that all of us had done about what had gone wrong in the ways that we studied previous drugs and what we were already doing wrong in terms of trying to figure out whether the protease inhibitors work. And we published it as this big report and started passing them out everywhere we went. Let's do this study.
They elevated themselves by their own self-education about these things. And then it became very, very clear that you weren't going to mess with these people because they knew exactly what you were talking about and they knew exactly what they were talking about.
Activists created a system that was able to do everything faster, better, cheaper, more ethically, and more effectively.
They forced people to put together the right clinical trials where you have the patient in mind and you weren't cutting corners.
So let's go back into patients, and let's go back into patients with Crixivan plus AZT plus 3TC.
The activists proposed a study design, industry used it, it got the drug approved in 6 months.
So I was at a meeting in Washington, and I stood up there and I showed for the first time the data in this study.
The data goes up on the screen and everyone gasps and cameras start to click, and just it's a realization that this is really great drug and it could work.
I remember sitting there in a hotel room in Washington, D.C., our hotel banquet room, and just crying. It was like, we did it. We did something.
It was too much to take in at that point. It wasn't until we started putting the drugs in our bodies, and we all went home and went straight on that regimen that had been on that slide, including Crixivan and 2 nucleoside analogs. And sure enough, it happened in us within 30 days. All of us. Undetectable, undetectable, undetectable.
The dying was stopping with triple drug combination. And if you needed your clinical trial, you could just go to these hospitals that were not filling up the way they were filling up with people with HIV.
You would see their Kaposi sarcoma lesions that had been bright and red and big, melting back into their skin.
They were calling it the Lazarus effect. People who were deathly ill get put on this drug and all of a sudden they're working again. That was a phenomenal feeling.
It worked. We did something remarkable.
So that breakthrough, that we thought was going to happen in 88 or 89 if we just worked fast enough, it did happen. But not until 96. And so, a lot of people died maybe if Reagan had started putting money into AIDS a little earlier. They wouldn't all be dead.
To be that threatened with extinction, and to not lay down, but instead to stand up and to fight back. The way we did it, the way we took care of ourselves and each other, the goodness that we showed, the humanity that we showed the world is just mind-boggling, just incredible.
Every single drug that's out there is because of ACT UP. I am convinced. We have the brain power and we have the street power. We have the good cops and the bad cops. The government didn't get us the drugs. No one else got us the drugs. We, ACT UP, got those drugs out there. It is the proudest achievement that the gay population of this world can ever claim.